an awful lot of podcasts or press interviews and whatever deal with the very quick. It's about the quote, it's about the excerpt, it's about the shock and the moment and so forth. And certainly as we get older and the more experience that we have, you can't simply discuss. So there are dichotomies, there are nuances to all kinds of argument and discussion that really people need time to talk about and absorb.
That was actor, playwright, and host of the Plastic Podcast, Doug Devaney. And I'm John Lee.
And I'm Martin Nutty. Welcome to another episode of Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation.
This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by the Irish Heritage Tree Program. Celebrate your Irish roots by planting native trees for family and friends in the beautiful Golden Vale of Ireland. Go to irishheritagetree.com and use the exclusive discount code today. It's IrishStew10 for 10% off. That code again is IrishStew and the numeral 10. Keep the heritage of Ireland green and growing by going to irishheritagetree.com. Well, welcome back to Irish Stew, and today we come to you from Brighton, England. Well, at least our guest is coming to you from there. He's Doug Devaney. Martin and I know him best as the host of the Plastic Podcast. That's his audio exploration of tales from the Irish diaspora, largely the diaspora in England, but Doug made an exception for us last fall when he invited your Irish Stew host to cross the pond electronically and join him for an episode of his The Plastic Podcast. But we find that Doug is made of much more than plastic. He's an actor, playwright, journalist, resident recordist. We're going to find out more about what that means later. And if you are listening to this right now with small children in the room, please ask them to leave. We'll give you a moment. Doug is also Santa Claus.
Shh.
Welcome, Doug.
Hello there. How are you doing?
Well, that's actually how you start the show, right? That's how you start your...
Very much so, yes.
So Martin would like to ask you that question in a different way.
Connus will too.
Doing fine myself, no. Yeah, marvellous. Thank you so much. Yes, you catch me just slowly but surely recovering from jet lag. Which is it's not just simply like moving from London to Brighton, but also the fact that I've actually crossed the pond physically. More recently, I just landed. Today is Thursday, and landed on Sunday. So I'm slowly but surely coming back into myself, having spent 2 weeks in California.
Fantastic. So not only crossed the pond, crossed the country, quite a haul.
It was quite a haul. My beloved and I went on something of a road trip between San Francisco and then across to Yosemite and then down onto the Pacific Coast, then out to Joshua Tree, then up to Grand Canyon and Monument Valley, then across to Las Vegas, curious place, a nervous breakdown in physical form, and then back up to San Francisco. Now we need a rest.
Quite a trip. I mean, I've only been to a few of the places you've mentioned.
Well, it was an opportunity, perhaps an opportunity of a lifetime. So we were going to grab it with both hands and a wheel.
So were you prospecting for Irish material, Doug?
Well, no, but Irish material comes upon you no matter where you are. I mean, let's face it, we're pretty much everywhere, and California is absolutely no exception. More recently, people have been talking about the Netflix series, The English. In relation to that, I was asking somebody who was in the same guest house as us in San Francisco why it is that whilst we talk about Irish Americans and Italian Americans and Polish Americans and German Americans and French Americans, why we never talk about English Americans. And my presumption had always been that there was a kind of like divide, a schism, because of empire. And independence, but she was saying actually it was because the presumption was Englishness,
right?
Which kind of turned me about a bit. And what's interesting about just talking to people generally and the podcasts themselves. I'm sure you found that with your own investigations, is that the presumptions that you made right at the very outset do tend to get turned around. I mean, so I genuinely thought that it was a similar case of in England, where we don't talk necessarily about being English Irish, but instead we talk about Liverpool Irish, London Irish, Birmingham Irish, and so forth, because there is a hangover, historically speaking, from what were called the Anglo-Irish, who were the English settlers and landlords who took most of the country and presided over it over the course of the 17 and 1800s and so forth. And I thought that was an echo in America, but no, it was the presumption of Englishness. And as I inevitably say, you can't talk about Irishness without talking about Englishness or Britishness. And I don't think you can talk about Irishness in America without actually talking about what it is to be American as well.
It's funny. I as a kid, I remember asking my parents. I grew up in a small New England city where it was Irish Americans, Polish Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, and saying, "Well, why aren't there English Americans?" I remember asking my parents. I don't know if they had a good answer, but I remember being curious about that, like when I was a kid.
Yes, yeah, and so I was talking with a wonderful woman called Quee, which was strangely short for Lucretia, and her forebears, her ancestors, were amongst the original 400 that survived the Mayflower journeys, and so forth. And so she was talking about the immigration history of America, where those 400 pilgrims were then followed by approximately 20,000 nonconformists who have been thrown out of England in all sorts of manners, and that how the strips of migration tend to still now colour approaches and attitudes towards government and so forth, as well as religion in the States, because you forget America is still a young country. I mean, it's like the 400 years or so we talk about the English Irish experience is almost double that of the settled the settled history of America, give or take.
Well, us Irish people would refer to it as 800 years of oppression, and maybe maybe the math. We might argue a little bit about the math a little bit, or
I think that probably only reinforces the point. If you talk about 800 years, just like just the proportions there are there. But I take your point, Martin. I take your point.
I'm feeling totally aggrieved at the moment, by this incorrect historical analysis.
You see, it's all a matter of time.
But let me ask you this, since I have spent not a lot of time in Britain. Let's talk a little bit about accents. Your accent. Where does your accent come from specifically?
My accent comes from all over the place, it must be said. I mean, this particular spoken basso profondo, which I proudly present, is probably only one of the several hundred voices that come out of my mouth at some point. I'm initially raised in Maidenhead, which is 50 miles west of London. My dad comes from County Clare, but my mum from a nearby town called Reading. Now, to give you your listeners some kind of sense of this, Maidenhead is known more fully as the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead. As in Windsor Castle and so forth. And whilst my voice sounds almost like perfectly BBC, the local accent is much more London with a little bit West Country thrown on in. And so it goes around a bit like that. So my uncle's from Reading, for example, will talk to my mum and go, "Oh, all right there, sis. How you doing?" Whereas Ricky Gervais in the English version of The Office, and I think people are familiar with that. That's based in Slough, and he's from Reading, so it's kind of that sort of accent is the local one. So a little bit of London with a little bit of country thrown on in. However, my mum was very insistent that we didn't sound like anybody local. So both myself and my brother resonate like my dad did, and still does. But my dad had two accents. One for talking to people, where he was Mike Devaney, and things like that, and then one for the phone, where he was Mike Devaney, and changed his accent accordingly. And that that again, I think, was down to the fact that it's like in the 70s and 80s, advertising your Irishness was not necessarily a thing that you wanted to do to strangers.
I want you to tell us a little bit about that, Doug. You do some great explorations of, the different ways to look at Irishness. You talk about the struggle to feel authentic, how the Irish diaspora still has a lot to say and a lot to learn, primarily about itself.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that's true of all diaspora communities, but I think it's emphasised with Irishness simply because of because of Ireland's proximity to England and to Britain. And we talk about Britain, but essentially, I think sometimes we're just talking about Englishness, because Scotland and Wales also have their own unique identities, and so on. And I think it's like and Martin doubtless will have a specialised response on that, which is that. When we talk about England, you talk about accents, for example, Martin. It's like it's curious. Somebody said about England that that in the States you can travel for 200 miles and still be in the same state, whereas in England you can travel for 50 miles. The accents change 3 times, and there's a different word for bread. And I think it's like where voices are concerned, we in England in particular, there are judgments that are made about those fine tunings of accent and so on. With regards to the period that we euphemistically call the Troubles, I think, and to be honest, I think that the sense of not making yourself known by your voice, it kind of came before that. And certainly an awful lot of my interviewees, when they talk about their parents or people of my father's generation, my dad's now 80, and he came across in 1959. So you're talking about then, there was a definite sense that you didn't advertise your Irishness, you didn't advertise your otherness, that you always made sure that you had the right amount of change for the bus, that you didn't necessarily go anywhere obvious nor to pick up an Irish paper and so forth. And I think that became much more emphasized during the period of the IRA campaign, particularly on the mainland and so forth, so that you didn't get seen as a terrorist by association. Not that actually probably helped you at all, because I think your accent and manners are given away in all sorts of different facets, not just through your voice. And I think that it's like people are going to make the presumptions that they make.
So your father, Doug, is from Clare.
County Clare, yes.
And he came over in 1959.
That's right.
So you kind of refer to the fact that pre the Troubles, people were disguising their accent. Do you have a theory as to, did he disguise his accent? And if so, why would he or his peers have chosen to do that at that point in time?
Well, I think because there's still that sense, probably less. I'm not going to make presumptions for my dad. I'm going to posit a theory though, which is that even then Irishness was seen as outsider. And I think that certainly when you talk to people whose forebears came on in during the mid 50s and prior to what are called the Windrush generation, who are the Caribbeans and Afro-Caribbeans who came on into Britain in order to find work and found themselves work as in the NHS and in public transport and so forth. The Irish who ended up working an awful lot of building sites and road work and trains and those what was called the Brawn Drain by a friend of mine from Ireland. They were essentially prior to Windrush, the Irish were considered almost the lowest of the low where immigration was concerned, and so there was a sign that went up: "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish," on various different landlords' windows and signs and so forth, that accommodation wasn't going to be allowed to Irish or to blacks or indeed to dogs. It's that sense that's like, you do not fit here. And I think and there was also Nina, no Irish need apply, which was placed onto job adverts and so forth. And I think it's like when Windrush came along, because it's like oddly there is it's like what happened was then that's like the Windrush generation came on in, and they took that place of being the lowest of the low, and the Irish moved up one step on the ladder. But that didn't necessarily mean that there wasn't prejudice or racism or presumptions about Irishness that you'd probably try and disguise in order to just try and get accommodation or work.
It kind of happened here with the Irish being that first mass wave of different people that came in, and then we got bumped up by the Italians.
Yeah, there's a controversy at the moment, which is about. This is why I'm kind of trying to step lightly around some of these terms. There's a controversy at the moment. A Black British MP wrote recently that the Irish Jews and travellers in Britain didn't suffer from the same level of prejudice or type of prejudice that blacks of African or Asian provenance suffered from, because because they weren't judged by their colour. And she says that they didn't encounter racism; they encountered prejudice, which I said is still important, but it's somewhat different. And that created a controversy because there's this notion that somehow there's a hierarchy of bias and, right. and prejudice, which has since become something of an argument. And you can, it's like I leave that open to other people to debate. All I can talk about is the Irish experience in Britain from my own family's perspective and from the perspective of my interviewees.
Yeah, it's a thorny area, so let's navigate.
To say the least.
Let's navigate somewhere else. Your Clare dad, was there many trips back and forth to Clare, and what was your experience there if that happened?
Not that many. What happened was that Dad came across in '59. To jump slightly back there, Dad was and still is the eldest of 11 surviving brothers and sisters, and his dad died when he was 14, and so Dad immediately became the breadwinner. And so forth. I tried various different jobs, and out in the west of Ireland, jobs were fairly limited. So he did all kinds of things, a bit of poaching, joined the Irish Army at underage, was found out and was obviously shipped out from there. Not before he had a very, very good St. Patrick's meal, though. His final job was working basically as a handler over at Shannon Airport. But that job was only there because a friend of the family had recommended him, and so on. And the problem was that if he got sacked or if he'd offended the friend of the family or anything like that, there weren't that many alternatives. So his uncle, my grandmother's twin brother, my Uncle Bren, rest his soul, came across to England beforehand. He settled in Maidenhead. It's about 50 miles outside of London, like I say. But also at that point, there were a lot of factories. There was a lot of manufacturing going on. So there was an awful lot of work. And also there was the possibility of movement of labour. It's that old story of the 50s and 60s in Britain, where if you lost a job on the Thursday, you get a new one by the Friday. There was an awful lot of manufacturing going on. There was an awful lot of work going on. So Dad came across in order to one, have a little more in the way of confidence that he could earn money, and also to send money back. And slowly but surely, the rest of the family came across. So I was born in '65. Much of the rest of the family, they came across in dribs and drabs. Some settled in West London, others in Manchester. But by the mid-'70s, all my immediate family had come across from County Clare. So there weren't that many trips back because there was nobody really to go back to. And so we didn't have that traditional notion of every summer we'd go back and spend time with the aunts and uncles in Ireland, because without wishing to put too fine a point on it, that there wasn't the money to go back, or indeed to have us to come over. The west of Ireland at that time was a very, very impoverished area.
Yeah. Doug, tell us a little bit about, growing up. Was it really an Irish enclave you were in, and how did you navigate your way to your, I'll just sort of encapsulate it by saying storytelling career?
Well, now then. I grew up on a council estate. It was called the Bomber Estate in Maidenhead, and it was so named because every single street was named after a World War II bomber. So there was Lancaster Avenue, Blenheim Road, etc., etc. Even the local pub was named the Merlin after the engine. All except our road, Aldershot Mules, which had been named after a local mayor who wanted his name on the new estate. And so there were a lot of Irish in there, but there was an awful lot of Londoners who come across and it's like whose families had settled after evacuation during the war. There was so you were kind of aware of Irishness as much through the church as anything, and it wasn't hugely well established. Our local church, St Edmund Campions, although was really like that actually didn't get a physical building until the mid '80s, and so you did Sunday services over in the hall of the local school, and. You kind of the weird thing was that you were aware of your Irishness simply by the virtue of the fact that you kind of gravitated towards each other. Yeah, you didn't just have church; you also had this sense of all of a sudden you realised that half of your friends were from across the water without really knowing it. I mean, obviously, when you had friends like Alan Patrick Murphy, that would be fairly obvious. Al, yes, born on the 24th of December to parents named Joseph and Mary, and they still called him Alan. Man who hated Christmas. Only one present. There you go. But you found yourself gravitating. I think because it's like there are, and I don't. It's like you get into really weird territory when you talk about this sort of thing. But there are shared currencies, and there are shared. There are shared interests and so forth. So it's like it's not surprising that an awful lot of us would end up, say, for example, knowing about the cowboy movies that our parents loved. In a way that's like the Irish tend to love a cowboy movie. I always said that that there was only 3 genuine albums in an Irish record collection. One was a bit of country, one was an Elvis, and one was like a show band like the Flingles. You kind of had the same a lot of the same physical and social vocabulary. And I think so. You just tended to kind of drift in together. So I wouldn't call it an enclave as so much as just like we kind of gathered like a school of fish.
It's interesting to me because, I grew up in, the Irish. I went to the Irish church, but, everybody around me was some other variation. Then there were other Irish Americans, but there wasn't sounds like there wasn't that overlay of GAA sports and Irish dance and tin whistle lessons. And
no, because we weren't we weren't that urban. We weren't so much in the middle of a city. I think it's like where if you're talking about Birmingham or Liverpool or Manchester or London or anything like that, you definitely have much more obvious Irish enclaves and so forth. But where a town like Maidenhead, where an awful lot of people are coming in for work, meant that there wasn't necessarily an Italian area or an Indian area or a Pakistani area or an Irish area and so forth. You just kind of rubbed along the same sort of ways, but you kind of knew where your fellow antecedents were, or your fellow Irish plastic paddies were.
So talk to us about leaving Maidenhead. If we follow along your path, what different other enclaves have you found yourself in? Is it a peripatetic lifestyle, or is it, a more rooted in a particular location?
It's weird. I started studying in Liverpool. I went from the southeast to the northwest, and you can't get a more Irish city than Liverpool. I started off trying to be a lawyer. I went for what happened was I was the first of our family that was likely, because of the lack of educational possibilities prior to that, to actually get to a university. So my dad's side went well, you're going to university. What are you going to do? Make it something you can use. And because I'd seen, there used to be a series in Britain called Crown Court, and I'd watch Petrocelli for fans of 70s TV. and so forth. And so I had this wonderful idea that I'd somehow be a verbal crime-busting lawyer somewhere along the line, and so decided I'd study law. By the time I got there, I decided that around about the age of 12. By the time I got to 16 or 17, I wanted to be Jim Morrison. And so I went to Liverpool, and so I followed this educational pattern in order to try and study law. And I got to Liverpool and started studying law, and it and me weren't best bedfellows. So I dropped out after a year, and I went to study drama and English at what they call a polytechnic, which is now also a university. It's basically art college. Drama and English, and I didn't become Jim Morrison, but I did start writing plays, and bits and pieces. I was kind of rootless for quite some time after university. I lived in Cambridge for a while. I lived in London for a while. I tried my hand at all kinds of things. I wasn't quite sure of where I was going. I moved to Brighton. I met someone. I moved to Brighton. We had children, and Jack and Sean, who are now 30 and 26. It's quite incredible that they survived me. And it's only, I think, much more recently that it's like I think Irishness has always been part of me and on my shoulder and so forth. But I think it's only more recently, and I think it's particularly as I've been aware of the aging nature of my dad's generation of family and so forth, and that sense that something may be lost once they go. I don't want to sound maudlin or anything like that, but there is a sense that's like their experience and their style of life. The fact that, say, for example, there's my Auntie Maureen, who is absolutely marvelous, but like, but part of her has never left County Clare. She still listens to Clare FM on the radio. She's still very much engaged with the church in a very, very, very traditional fashion. And so forth. But half of that family that are in Manchester, they'll talk with the Irish accent. And the other half will talk with the Manchester accent and talk like that. And you can kind of see where the generational divide has happened. And I don't want some of that to be lost forever just to the air. But it's not just about my family. It's also about like those other stories about what it is to come to a country and feel as though you're kind of outside, and also the inheritance that you have of sight. I feel as though that itinerant nature that I've had, that kind of slightly wandering, lost aspect, is partly because I've never been quite sure of who I am until much more recently.
You know, as an outside observer of the Irish in Britain, I'm curious as to the difference between the Irish in America and the Irish in Britain. So the Irish in America are very kind of front-footed, chest thump, wear the green, etc. It strikes me in Britain, because of the nature of various prejudices that seem to have been foisted upon the Irish, that people kind of quickly have lost that identity, you know, within one or two generations. Do you think that's a fair description? Because that's kind of what you seem to be saying to me there.
I think that's relatively fair. I mean, so obviously individual cases are individual cases. Mm-hmm. But I do feel as though there is a sense that by the time you get around to third generation, that the connection is thinner, weaker, paler, if you will. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. I mean, so like answer on two sides of paper. I suppose it's that sense that so like, are you constantly going to sort of like still hang on to a mythic past or look towards the future in the new home, or do you lose something that you'll never get back by just letting go? And do you lose that connection to your forebears, your ancestors? I mean, it's like my sense of it is that the past shouldn't be necessarily beholden to, but at least not forgotten either. Mm-hmm. And I think it's like I talked to somebody recently, well, last fall, and she said, "You are your ancestors' wildest dreams." And I think that's an incredible phrase to use.
Love that.
About progress. But it also means that you remember your ancestors and the dreams that they had. And the dreams that they had may be very, very simple ones. It may just be simple ones of like getting enough money to your family so that they can survive. I think the British Irish experience is coloured by the fact that it is a British Irish experience rather than an American Irish experience, and an American history. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Has this sense that is known as manifest destiny. This sense that striving forward and moving forward, you bring your identity with you, but you move forward, and there's something to move forward towards. Whereas I think Britain has been more like a haven in an awful lot of cases. And when people shelter, sometimes they shy back.
Right.
I would, my take on it would be this. The Irish, when they came to America, the Catholic Irish now I'm speaking about, talk about them, the poor Irish. When they showed up in America during the famine period, maybe slightly earlier and thereafter, it took them 100 years to get accepted. It was to some degree not until the election of JFK that all of a sudden Irish Catholic Americans became mainstreamed. The English case, seems to me, has been obviously heavily coloured by the troubles of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And now you've gotten to a point where it's safe to stick your head up above the parapet, that all of a sudden Ireland is no longer the poor, ignorant country that a lot of times it was, considered to be. If anything, Ireland, because of its economic and cultural success now, has become cool, but I'm not sure how much longer that will take for people to kind of feel good about that and embrace it.
I think you're right in an awful lot of ways. I think it's a more complicated question than that. I think, though. I mean, for example, every November the 5th, we mark the burning of a Catholic. We have bonfire night, we have Guy Fawkes night, and so forth. And now there are an awful lot of. I was watching a history program about this something. There are an awful lot of attempts to get rid of James I, not necessarily the most popular king, and so forth. But the one that is absolutely, definitely marked and celebrated, and has done for the last 300, 400 years, and so forth. Which is why I think where my 400 year number essentially comes from is Guy Fawkes, who's essentially Irish Catholic, and I think that one of the reasons why that was turned into such a great big public celebration was in order to make sure that the Irish knew their place in this country. And not very far from Brighton, there's an area called Lewis, and Lewis has a notorious bonfire that takes place where. It's a relatively recent one, but it has some rather curious traditions. One of which is to actually sing a song about burning the Pope. And it's when you have these kind of these kind of things turn up almost without thought, then it's very easy to go, how far above the parapet do you want to put your head? John O'Donoghue, who was the first interviewee on the Plastic Podcasts, talks about the Irish quarterfinal appearance in Italia '90 in the World Cup as being that moment when the Irish and England could finally place their heads above the parapet and say, we can compete on your level. And not only that, but because the Irish team, Jack Charlton's team, was so comprised of so many Irish diaspora football players, it created a certain amount of controversy in Ireland. As an old friend of ours, Brian Bean, a father of one of your guests, Janet. Brian, as I said, Jack Charlton's a fine man, but you think he'd let some of our lads play once in a while. But that was the moment that the Irish felt as though they could, or the Irish diaspora in this country felt as though they could put their heads above the parapet and so forth. And there's also an obverse thing. I encountered the term plastic paddy when I was in Clare. And it was from one of my dad's cousins, cousin Packy, who asked me about myself. I was talking about Liverpool to London to Brighton, and so on. I went, you're a plastic. And simply dismissed me as that, because there is a level of guilt. There's a level of guilt by association, by the fact that you have your part of your ancestry, my English part of my ancestry, has been part of that 800 years that you talk about, Martin. And that somewhere along the line, there are some who consider that anybody who's really engaged with the English, I mean, so this is an old notion. I'm sure it applies only to a tiny minority nowadays in an Ireland that has actually become a hugely forward-thinking 21st century nation in a way that England can sometimes look upon and wonder. But it is the case that you carry sort of the guilt of Englishness with you, as well as you carry the guilt of Englishness in Ireland, and and the fear of Irishness in England, and that's a very, very different experience to the one that you might have in America. It's a long answer to a short question.
Well, maybe we'll get back to it because Martin has an English heritage as well that comes out every now and then in podcasts, and it's an interesting point of discussion for us. Doug, let's get back to Doug, the man, the myth, the legend,
the legend.
Yes. The beloved voice of the Plastic Podcast. Give us a little more. I have to say we come in fairly prepared for all our guests because we bone up on their LinkedIn profiles and their bios and their histories. We don't have such a great sense of step A to step B, how you move through different parts of your career, how you put bread on the table, and then ultimately how you ended up with this podcast.
Okay. So yes, the positive personal biography. I raised my children for about 10 years of my life. I'm divorced, and so we're talking about my ex-wife here. And she worked while I raised the children. We had a turnabout of the traditional marital situation. At that time, I was also a struggling writer and occasional actor, and it was. Inevitably, it's very, very difficult for any parent, particularly the domestic parent, the domesticated parent, to find themselves a career simply because you are essentially at the behest of your children. If they're going to be ill, then your plans go out the window. If something happens, you have to be able to drop everything. And so, an awful lot of jobs that I took were ones that were kind of essentially casual. I worked in the local library, which was absolutely marvelous. My love of books and film meant that I could engage in that form. I worked in various bars, much the same joy. But I also worked as a cleaner. I'd work as a telephone sales. I'd take pretty much any and every job, but they would inevitably be jobs that had no real future to them, simply because I had a commitment elsewhere. As they grew older, and also it's like other things took place in life. I was able to be freer in order to pursue more in the way of performing. And so you mentioned Santa. So Santa and what used to call event work used to be my bread and butter, along with acting. So where the acting was concerned, I did a number of one-man shows, because that way I knew I could turn up for rehearsals, and also because they were cheaper to put together. So I did a number of one-man shows, particularly about myself, because I find myself endlessly fascinating, as doubtless you discovered. And
the angina monologue,
the angina monologue, but that was preceded by Mein Gut. The story of one man's losing battle in the war against obesity. I was a lot bigger back then, yes, I wrote about the moral panic that was taking place at that point about obesity in this country. I don't know if it was shared in America, but certainly we had that. And I'd get people shouting insults at me in the street about my weight and so forth. It's a curious thing. And some people say, well, you could diet, but yeah. But it's the politics of food were kind of interesting, as well as the fact that once upon a time, a man of substance, as we might say, was once considered to be a man who'd earned enough in order to get that substance, and now it's seen as indulgence. as somebody once said, like obesity is a sin, and also was it anorexia is a disease and obesity is a lifestyle choice. I don't know. But I did that mind gut, and at one point I ended up like it's strange what people get interested in. I was performing it, and the climax of the tale finished with me engaging with a bit of roast chicken in what can only be described as an obscene fashion, and there were Guinness involved as well. There goes the sponsorship, and. So anyway, it's like I was performing downstairs in a venue in Brighton, which is for American listeners, it's like if you consider it like a very, very cheap San Francisco, you wouldn't be far off. It's a lot of hills. It's also very bohemian. It's a huge LGBTQ plus center of life and activity and so forth. It's the Brighton Festival is currently ongoing, and it's the largest arts festival in England. That sort of thing. So I was performing downstairs at a vegetarian and vegan venue, and of course, somebody suggested that I might want to actually warn. So I have a word with the venue that I was doing this with a chicken, a roast chicken, and they said, "Well, you might want to put a warning on the door." And so having I qualified as a journalist as I can because I writing is essentially like at the heart of what I do, and communication and writing are the heart of anything that I wanted to try. So I contacted a local journalist of my acquaintance, and I said, "Is this a story?" And she went, "Of course it's a story." And so I'm posing outside the venue wearing a Hawaiian shirt and eating chicken, whilst the various denizens of the vegetarian and vegan restaurant look upon me as though I'm a complete maniac. It turns up in the local paper. I then get approached by various other national newspapers. I'm phoned up in the middle of rehearsal by a newspaper known as the Daily Mail, to whom I wouldn't normally give house room, but they were on the end of the phone. And you try to be polite. That's the British part of it. And they said, "Do you think this is political correctness run mad?" Which is where I draw the line at any interview. At some point, the newspaper The Sun put a story up there, but instead of having a photo of me, they had a picture of a roast chicken as part of a dinner, because Sun readers need that kind of visual aid. It turned up on Fox News. It turned up in Polish news. It turned up all over the place. I wanted to be in highfalutin, big broadsheet newspapers, the equivalent of the Washington Post or something like that. Instead, I'm in the comics. But yeah, it's like it became something of it's like a weird cause célèbre for about 48 hours, and that was odd. I had a heart moment, and I put together something called the angina monologue. I collapsed in the middle of the street whilst carrying a ukulele, like you do.
Was it a heavy ukulele?
It wasn't that heavy. No, the strings were quite light. I was off to do a performance for a breast cancer charity. Boy, did I pick the wrong charity. Collapsed in the middle of the street. Got caught, I'd say, from smacking up my head on the pavement by another actor. This is what Brighton's like. It's like San Francisco. You can't move for thespians, and you went off. I did the gig because I was adrenalized. Went across the side of front. You'll never have no idea what happened to me because of my chest. I felt like my heart was coming out my chest. My eyes were rolling the sockets. I collapsed into basically white cotton wool as far as I was concerned. It was a real kind of whole archetypical near-death experience and so forth. And it was only when trying to run for a bus afterwards that I suddenly seized up and went, "Oh no, that's not going to happen." Mm-hmm. And ended up in hospital and lying on the gurney, as they say. And as the nurses were gathered round and so forth, I thought, I've got a title for a show, which was the angina monologue. You've got to have a heart. So toured that up and down, and so forth. And so an awful lot of the work that I ended up doing as a performer was either biographical or investigatory. So with Chronicle Theatre, which I set up, we lived as homeless in Gatwick in order to do a piece about the homeless who live in Gatwick. So real sort of like a journo aspect of things. And so people's stories have always been central to what I've done. And so I think that kind of rolled into doing the the plastic podcasts. Initially, what was going to happen was after Brexit took place, there was a huge rush for Irish passports, and I was part of that rush. It has to be said, I am not just a plastic paddy, but what's also described as a passport paddy. And I was going to write a piece partly about my family, partly about their story, but also about that whole movement of Irish identity in Britain, from essentially being the butt of thick Mick jokes and suspicions with the IRA and so forth, through to a kind of acceptance in the 90s with the World Cup and U2 and so forth, and it's like an Irishness, so like becoming a kind of it's like a modern it's like a modern artistic creed and called courtesy of music and so forth, into it's like the Irish passport now being your last exit from Brexit. And that seemed to me to be a neat little, it's like a narrative arc to follow. And then COVID happened. And all my intentions of putting out a one-man show disappeared on the wind. However, I had intended on starting to interview members of the Irish diaspora in order to get their perspective. So I can't continue with the interviews, because like we three here, the interviews could take place at a medically approved distance, and as a result, the podcast started. And initially, they were going to simply be an adjunct to the show, but they took on a life of their own. As I realised that neat little narrative arc that I talked about wasn't a neat little arc at all, and it was spiky, and it went off in different directions, and it incorporated aspects of Irishness that I'd not really thought of. About the way that cities identify themselves in this country as with their Irishness. So there is a London Irishness, there's a Birmingham Irishness, there is a Liverpool or a Manchester Irishness, which has as much to do with the city as it has to do with the Irishness. About mixed race Irishness, about the status or otherwise of Irish travellers in this country, and also of their status within the Irish diaspora themselves. Irishness became a jumping off point then for the individual stories, and to finish this particular monologue with a cliche, everyone has a story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the stories that I think it's the first of your episodes I listened to that really made a big impression on me, and it encapsulates a lot of what you're just talking about now. And if I'm saying his name correctly, Anthony Ekundayo-Lennon.
Anthony Ekundayo-Lennon, yes, indeed.
And the story of the genetic echo. That was a great entry into the plastic podcast.
It's a fascinating story. It's exceptional in so many ways, because just to give a brief summary of the episode for your listeners, Anthony and his brother were born to two white Irish parents from Dublin, born in West London. They were born with the colouring and facial features of mixed race African children. And the suspicions that Anthony's father had about what had happened with his wife, the prejudices that they encountered as people from a white family who were considered ostensibly black in the 1970s and 80s, where police activity towards young black men was hostile, to say the least, particularly in London, and the presumptions that were made about him in all sorts of ways, frankly heartbreaking. But it came to a head when actually it's like he became a theatre director and was granted a bursary by the Arts Council in England as a director with a black and African arts theatre company. And then somebody said, "You know that he really comes from a white family, don't you?" And then this all blew up about him somehow identifying as black, whereas in fact all he was doing was identifying as himself. And that particular episode asks so many questions about identity, about how we identify ourselves, about how the world identifies us, and the fact that he came through it with anything like the grace and dignity that he has is something of a miracle. It is a without wishing to plug myself too much, before the shameless plug section of your podcast, yes, if you are to listen to any of the podcasts that we do, I would, and I hope you listen to them all, I would recommend Anthony Akindayo amongst them, yes.
I kind of agree with, well, I haven't listened to all your podcast episodes, and shame on me, Doug. But
shame on you, Martin, shame on you.
But I agree with John. I think that's an astonishing story. And there's so much to be learned about, genetics, which, as I understand it, at least at some point provided some relief to your guest.
Yes.
Because his story had always been questioned. And then, but I will leave our listeners, and we'll put that in our show notes, that particular episode, because I think it's an astonishingly good piece. And I was fascinated and found it educational and enjoyed it,
He's a remarkably brave individual. It took a long time for us to actually be able to get together and do that, because I think he was naturally disinclined to sort of necessarily talk until we'd established an element of trust and communication within communication.
But you talk about how the podcast has taken you down channels, unexpected channels. Mm-hmm. So Anthony's story is obviously one. Is there another one that jumps to mind that you can tell our listeners about?
Along with Anthony's, I think there are the interviews that I've done with members of the Irish traveller community. And there are 3 of those that you can you can find amongst my various different interviewees. They've been fascinating as much as it's like you become aware of another level of prejudice. You become aware of a prejudice of Irish against Irish, where the fact that you are born into a community who, to all intents and purposes, look and sound exactly the same as the rest of the community. This isn't like again. We talk about the British MP who talked about almost this hierarchy of racism versus prejudice and so forth. Here, on the outside, pretty much everything's the same, except for one thing: one group of travellers and one group of settled. Or rather, not travellers, because there are such people who are settled travellers. So, and the prejudice that exists against them, both in Ireland and in this country, is a reminder that perhaps we might have a tendency sometimes to look at the situation in Ireland as I go, because it has become so progressive that everything in the garden is green, and it's not necessarily the case. And also to look upon the prejudices that we have in this country to a community who have been essentially vilified by an awful lot of what we would naturally call the liberal press. Channel 4 in this country is considered to be a benchmark, or was considered to be a benchmark for liberal broadcasting, but has put out a number of rather distasteful programs, such as my big fat gypsy wedding, or The Truth About Traveller Crime, where the presumption is that the travellers are somehow not quite honest or right or entitled to their own sense of tradition and community. But they essentially become that equivalent of Punch magazine in the 1800s, and their representations of Irishness back then.
Doug, I would agree with Martin. I don't really, outside really your podcast and some other reading, I'm not too familiar with the stories of the travelers, but I did have one association a few years back was over a film called Knuckle. Mm-hmm. It was a documentary of the sort of traveler boxing
the bare knuckle
tradition, and it was a film that was screening here in New York, and I was involved with the promotion of it. And I met some of the travelers who were in the film, and I have to say that's probably really the extent of my knowledge outside of what I've learned from your podcast.
I have to emphasize, I don't pretend to speak on behalf of their communities. It would be
well,
wrong.
you let people, you've given people a platform to speak on their own behalf.
Yes, because I think the thing about the podcast, and I'm sure you guys have much the same sort of thing, is that it's like the more that people are able to speak, the more understanding is available to us all, and also giving people time to speak is the hugely important thing. An awful lot of podcasts or press interviews and whatever deal with the very quick. It's about the quote. It's about the it's about the excerpt. It's about the shock and the moment and so forth. And certainly as we get older, it's like and the more experience that we have, you can't simply discuss. So there are dichotomies. There are nuances to all kinds of argument and discussion that really people need time to talk about and absorb. Brian Eno once said that sometimes we talk in order to find out what we're thinking, and I think that's very, very true. And I think it's like sometimes the opportunity to actually talk at length to somebody gives them also the opportunity to work out what it is that they're saying.
Doug, which reminds me of a quote from a media studies class I took. Thought travels in the well-worn grooves of language.
Oh, that's nice.
And I should remember who the famous person was, but it's not coming to me at the moment. But speaking of famous people and significant people, we like to steal liberally from other people's podcasts, including the Plastic Podcasts.
Yes.
And
my lawyers have been in contact.
You have a great segment that allows you to kind of bring the guests forward into future episodes and kind of reflect back to what they said, called the Plastic Pedestal. And both Martin and I had the treat of providing our plastic pedestal person, the Irish diaspora person who was most significant or influential. So we're going to turn the tables on you, Doug. Who do you place on the plastic pedestal?
Well, it's not such a turnabout because I provided the first plastic pedestal because I'd had no previous guests. But I will stick with my original choice, and that's the broadcaster Terry Wogan. I don't know how familiar American listeners are with Terry Wogan, but he was something of an institution. He Dublin born, no correction, but he was Dublin based at first, and was a banker for a while before he came across this country. And in 1967, he was part of the original lineup of BBC Radio 1 and BBC Radio 2. Terry was an institution as much as he was probably the most listened to morning DJ in the country. He had a remarkable way of speaking, a little like this. Hello there, listener. Yes. Incredibly erudite, went off on flights of fancy, very, very whimsical. But also, it's like I think he belied the traditional notion of what an Irishman was. I mean, so there have been predecessors. I think, so to a certain extent, Eamon Andrews, it's like had presented a different view of Irishness as a broadcaster, and I think possibly Dave Allen as a comedian had done much the same. But where Wogan was concerned, he managed to instill himself into the hearts and minds of the British in a way that they didn't. He was there constantly, egging, urging, jollying along. When he died, it did feel as though a member of the family had gone. And I think that was hugely important. I think he paved the way for an awful lot of Irish broadcasters in Britain. For them to be accepted as being witty and urbane and well-read and approachable and so forth, and not just simply that the caricature that the jokes about the Irish had created over the course of 20, 30, 40, 800 years. And also, more personally, when I was getting confirmation at St. Joseph's Church in Maidenhead, my father was beside himself with joy, not because I was finally a member of the Catholic faith, but because there, 2 aisles up for us, making sure that his daughter was part of the same ceremony, was Wogan himself. Now, that, as far as my dad was concerned, was the icing on on a very green cake, because he lived kind of around the Maidenhead area, which was not surprising. 50 miles from London, a lot of broadcasters kind of lived in that area. And so to hear Tell talk about the confirmation on his Monday show afterwards and so forth was just like, yeah, pie in the sky for my dad. So I think for all sorts of reasons, both personal and also historical, and for being part of managing to, I think, like a place. Put a foot in the sand for the Irish in Britain, in a way that few others were capable of at the time. I think it would have to be Wogan. Yeah.
Yeah, when I think about Terry Wogan, there's a couple of words that jump to mind, and one would be beloved, and the other one would be kindness. He was a guy that was quite funny, but rarely at the expense of other people.
No.
So he kind of, proves a point that you too can have a great career and be a good guy at the same time. But speaking of kindness, we're getting to that point in our podcast where we introduce shameless plug. We might like to pretend that it is a kindness that we extend to our guests, but indeed you're the one that is being kind by taking the time to speak with us. But let us hear about your shameless plug.
My shameless plug inevitably is going to be the Plastic Podcasts. Available to all and sundry, courtesy of the website www.plasticpodcasts.com. Simply make your way across the episodes page, and there you'll find, I think it's now some 44 episodes. The podcasts have taken a bit of a change this year. Whereas previously they've been presented in tranches of 6 episodes per series and 2 episodes per year. It's with a couple of specials thrown on in there. I'm now about to present them as once a month throughout the entire, throughout the rest of eternity, I think. That each and every one I consider to be a child. So we talk about Anti-Decadalian, but I don't actually have any favourites because each and every one is a different offspring in their own ways. But it's like I've decided to do one a month, partly in order to just make sure there's a constant presence there, and also partly because I think sometimes when I do 6 in a tranche and so forth, and one a week and so forth, it becomes a little too much for the listener to keep up with all the various different social media aspects that all inevitably come with a project like this. So stretching it out means that this becomes not so much a series as an ongoing epic journey. And by the time we talk, the first episode of this ongoing epic journey will have already come out with Declan McSweeney, a Irish-born journalist, talking about the trials and difficulties of actually being an Irish journalist dealing with the local news in England rather than being a national journalist, and what he has to say about that. Thereafter, there are numerous interviewees. We've got artists. We've got an architect who's also Irish traveller. We've got a producer of radio documentaries, including documentaries about the birds. We've got who else do we have? A vast array of forthcoming interviewees, but also I say we've got a fair old backlog, my friends, a fair old backlog of some 44 interviewees. So if I'm going to plug anything, it's going to be the website, www.plasticpodcasts.com.
And of course, Doug, I hope I'm not going off message. It's on other podcast players as well.
It's on other podcast players as well. Yeah, other podcast players are available. However, on the website, you also get to read my blogs. You see, there you go. The insights and otherwise.
It is great. Like, I like to scroll back through our own back catalog and I have that same feeling. People will ask, what's your favorite episode? And I think, well, there's this one. No, but there's this one. Well, there was also this one. I like this one,
Yeah. They're all. I'm sorry. Jar Wobble, who was a bass player with Public Image Limited and so forth. It was wonderful to interview him because basically it was him in his living room,
Yes.
and then as he went across to his kitchen in order to start put together a microwave meal and drop the plate in the middle of it. I mean, it's like we were thoroughly professional at that point. There have been three-way interviews with members of the Liverpool and Leeds Irish social clubs. I'd love to do more Irish social clubs. There was Dame Elizabeth Anionwu, who is a leading nurse and practitioner in this country, but so part Irish, part Nigerian, and so forth, who was raised in a convent, and so just it's fascinating stories all the way along. And all you have to go is sort of like, I am just so grateful, so incredibly grateful that relative, in fact, perfect strangers are happy to just talk and reveal themselves to me. It's quite incredible.
Doug, we share your feelings there. We're so happy to be on this same voyage of discovery, this trip through the diaspora.
Bless you, gentlemen. The work that you do is incredible. I'm huge. I'm a huge fan.
And great to get the English diaspora feeling, both from the diaspora in England, both from talking to you and then listening to your podcast. So anyway, Doug, it's great to be on this global Irish diaspora journey with you. I'm really encouraged when you say for eternity. Let's keep it all coming. Let's keep working together. And I foresee some good collaboration among all of us down the road.
Bless you, gentlemen. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, Martin, that was kind of like talking to an old friend. Doug had us on his great podcast, the Plastic Podcast, and it was really great to, a really fun guy to talk to and a nice mix of serious discussion. And you can see the natural comic actor that we were talking to come out frequently.
Yeah, I'd say Doug is our English soulmate in a way because he's treading a lot of the same areas that we do in our podcast. And one of the things that we do have in common is the long form nature of our podcasts. A lot of times you're told, keep it down to the length of a commute, 30 or 40 minutes. What I think Doug expressed towards the end of the episode, and what I agree with, is that you can only really get to terms with what motivates a guest by really exploring in depth their experience. And you just can't do that in 10, 15, or 20 minutes. It takes time. And so that, I believe, is the real power of podcasting. The problem is with mass media news, it only ever gets at the veneer. I like to think that we being Doug, you, and I, get to some kind of significant level of depth that really engages our users and deepens the understanding of the Irish experience.
And even with that, Martin, even with roughly an hour to speak, there's still always that feeling that we're just scratching the surface. There's so many aspects to Doug's career we didn't talk about. We really didn't get too far into his Santa Claus career. There's other things I know he's done, and there's other episodes we could have gone to in depth. So even with an hour, there's so many more stories to tell. We hope we pointed you towards some good thoughts and good ideas and helped you get to know Doug Devaney. We certainly enjoy getting to know him better.
And until the next time, folks, it's been a real pleasure. And if this is your first time hearing the Irish Stew podcast, don't forget to subscribe or follow or whatever your podcast app enables you to do so you don't miss another great episode of Irish Stew. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.